I'd like to welcome you all to the first of our leadership forums this year. My co-host, Maddie Maxwell, and I'd also like to welcome Stuart Warren. We've got an exciting year ahead planned, and we're expecting the forum to grow again this year. And we actually invite you to invite all your colleagues and also bring whole school staff. And it's a great opportunity to have it as PLD for your whole team. So as I said, it's fantastic to have you here. We've had a slight delay getting started this term, and I'm actually just going to be upfront about this now. Some of you may know that I met with a slight accident and got a bit of concussion. And very occasionally, I'm actually forgetting the right word, or actually even forgetting if I have to change the screen, I'm forgetting where I'm going or what I'm doing. So if that happens to happen this afternoon, you're welcome to actually laugh along with me. But I am recovering and I'm looking forward to the school holidays just to have that extra time. Now, I would also like to invite you this afternoon to put your name, your school email and your address in the chat box. And this way you will actually receive direct information about all the forums as they come up. You will also receive the information for each forum and also the recordings for each forum. I'm also keeping an eye on the chat box, that's great. And I will do so throughout the time that Stuart is speaking so that we can identify questions and things as we go along. So do put your name, your email address and your school in the chat box. And we've also got a free giveaway at the end for one of my books, Raising Children with Learning Difficulties, A Guide for Schools. So you never know, you might be that lucky winner. So without further ado, I'd actually like to welcome Stuart. I would like to first of all answer the question, why Stuart Warren? And many of you will know that I've had a long time interest in working and understanding children with learning difficulties and vision type problems. And so it's been an area of interest of mine. And I originally became involved with Stuart Warren around the Icept app. I had heard about Icept and what a wonderful app it was for identifying the visual tests and auditory problems that children were having. And that's how we started our connection. It wasn't long after I started working with Stuart that I realized the depth of his international research knowledge and the backing and the basis he had for his work. And very much in education now, we're interested in evidence-based practice and best evidence synthesis. And it was this area that just really took me down the path of working with Stuart because of his international research and his working with worldwide specialists. Now, of course, he has a very comprehensive process and he also provides mentoring and assisting schools to identify vision and learning. So welcome, Stuart. I'm really looking forward to sharing this journey with you and with schools as we go about addressing the very important challenges that we have with vision problems and student achievement. Now, as I said, feel free to pop your questions in the chat as we go along. I know what Stuart's going to cover, so if I know he's going to cover it, I'll wait. But if I feel it's a relevant question for this slide, I will raise my hand, Stuart, and wave, and we can take the question as we go. So great to have you all, and without further ado, Stuart Warren.
Alrighty, well, thanks for that introduction, Jenny. You can hear me okay there?
Perfect.
Coming through good. Yeah, well, thanks for the invitation to share with you all at this leadership forum. And as Jenny mentioned, my background is in optometry, and I've had an interest in students with learning difficulties for probably some over 20 years now. And curiously, yeah, it wasn't really my intention to follow through with behavioural optometry, but in fact, I decided to do a course in behavioural optometry quite a few years ago through the University of New South Wales, thinking that maybe I should find out a bit more about behavioural optometry. And actually at that time, I didn't even have an accurate picture of what behavioural optometry involved. And that's despite me being in the profession. So I mention this because maybe you've heard about behavioural optometrists and that behavioural optometrists prescribe tinted lenses for all their patients and think that vision is the cause of dyslexia. But I just want to assure you that that's not true. What I actually found was that there were many capable and competent optometrists in this field, and they were actually genuinely interested in trying to address some of the more difficult areas in optometry. And in actual fact, many optometrists that get into this area do so because they themselves have a child or family member that they want to help out. So the name behavioural optometry is actually used to cover a whole range of areas that target various populations. And this includes things like athletes, Paralympics or Olympians, head injury, maybe special population groups like, say, Down syndrome. And learning difficulties is just one of those special population groups. So that said, I think the underlying idea, converging idea of behavioural optometry is that vision guides a lot of our behaviours. And as educators, I'm sure that you'd agree that vision is very important for learning. And so what I'm hoping to do today is maybe unpack that a little more for you. And I should point out that this is actually the first in a series of 4 presentations. So this is more like the introduction. And I do happen to mention my app that Jenny was referring to, but whether you decide to use the app or not, then my main goal for today is that you'll come away actually from each of the presentations having learned more about the role of vision in learning and how visually based interventions could actually fit into your educational model. So if you're a bit new to this area, then I know it may seem like a little bit to take on board, but the reason I'm here today is because I believe that vision is a critical piece of the puzzle for achieving better learning outcomes. And if I can help to provide some real solutions for real problems, then at the end of the day, I think it's going to be worthwhile for everyone, and especially your students. So I appreciate that there may be some people out there that actually have a different view, and that's okay. But what I bring today is a background of clinical practice as well as an interest in the science. And everything that I'll share with you today is the result of years of investigation, and it actually represents my best attempt to bring together both theory and practice. So that said, I've got a bit to cover this afternoon, and I know everyone's time's limited, so I'd like to get underway and share some slides with you, if I may. So let me just switch across to my presentation here. So as you guys can see from my title here, that I'll also be including some aspects of auditory processing. And obviously I'm not an audiologist, but the principles are very similar. And practically speaking, it makes sense that if you're going to screen for visual processing problems, then screening for some auditory processing problems is probably worthwhile. So on today's presentation, this is what I'm going to be covering. I'm going to be sharing some basic terms and concepts. And I'm also going to be talking about why I developed Icept. And even though I've called this why Icept, I could easily have called this why we should introduce visual and auditory processing interventions into the school. But that's probably a little bit too long to fit in the box. So I've just called it why Icept. As mentioned, this will be the first in a series of talks. So the second talk that I do will actually cover some of the neuroscience of reading, and then I'll go through some tests that you can do to test for visual and auditory processing problems. On the third presentation, I will go over how we can address some of these problems with daily training, and I'll also take a look at some supporting studies for this. And finally, on the fourth presentation, I'll be looking at screening for some near vision problems. And this is basically like a preliminary test that needs to be done before starting training. And following that, I'll be talking about how to set up a program in your school. So that gives you a bit of an overall direction of where I hope to be going. The presentations after this one will have a fee, but if you decide to follow through with the extra presentations, then what I'll do is include some free licenses for you guys so that you can test it out on some students at school. So following on from this, then I'm also hoping to provide a couple of follow-up presentations, and this is something new that I hope to offer, just to provide additional support to schools. And that is if you've implemented Icept and maybe you have some questions or some issues. If you're a school that's already using Icept, then you may want to consider signing up for this for term 2. Once a school, however, has properly figured out how to position the intervention, then it's actually fairly straightforward, but getting there may be a little bit of a process, because these types of interventions at the end of the day are not really something that teachers may be acquainted with. Yeah, so let's start by looking at some basic terms and concepts. And the first concept that I have here is learning has 2 components. And the first component there is the input side, and that's really how we go about acquiring the information. And this then transitions into the output side, how we use that information for reading, spelling, maths, and writing. So what I'm going to do today is concentrate more on the input side, really from a visual and auditory point of view. But I appreciate that there are also other inputs that do go into academic learning. So if you've thought about visual and auditory input at all, then it's probably more in the context of students needing to have good eyesight and hearing. And more than likely, your school has some kind of vision and hearing screening program. As valuable as that is, however, visual and auditory input involves a lot more than just having good eyesight and hearing. And in fact, most students with learning difficulties, they do have normal eyesight and hearing. And of course, if there is a problem with eyesight or hearing, I think everyone listening would agree that this should be addressed. However, there are some other aspects to consider. Yeah, so this leads me to the second concept. And as an optometrist, I like to think of 3 levels of sensory input. And the first one there is eyesight and hearing, which I've just mentioned. So that one I'm not really going to discuss at all. The second level is basically near vision, which is essentially vision at close range as opposed to far distance vision. And near vision needs to be clear, single, and steady. So keep in mind that just because you've got good distance vision doesn't necessarily mean that the near vision is good. And it's actually estimated that around 5 to 15% of all students, whether they have learning difficulties or not, actually have a near vision problem. Some would argue that this percentage is higher for kids with learning difficulties, but I just tend to take a conservative approach and assume they're the same. If a problem does occur at this level, then I should point out that it's probably not the cause of a learning difficulty, but it will have the effect of impairing a student's progress. And that's largely because the student will be inclined to give up and sort of stop the task. And you and I would probably do exactly the same thing. So I'm not going to dwell too much on this either. And I actually cover this in more detail on the fourth presentation. So the third level of visual and auditory processing. And this is where actually most of the problems, in fact, lie. So it's going to be the main focus of my presentation. I thought I'd start off by giving you this definition of visual and auditory processing. And what I've got here is the analysis of visual and auditory information in the brain so that it can be used for higher functions. Possibly I could have said here higher cognitive functions. And so from this definition, you can see that visual and auditory processing actually precedes language. So what that means is if there's a problem with visual and auditory processing, then it's likely to have a downstream effect on higher thinking skills, whether that be reading or maths, following instructions, even fine motor skills. So even though I refer to reading, actually vision impacts on a broad range of skills. Just a few other terms that I thought I should put up because visual and auditory processing does go under other names. And another common term is visual and auditory perceptual skills. So basically the same thing. And sometimes these are also referred to as high-level visual and auditory skills. And that's because they engage the brain at a higher level of processing than, say, just eyesight or hearing. Now, having said that, just to confuse you all, they can also be referred to as low-level cognitive skills. And that's because as far as cognitive processing goes, they actually engage the brain at the bottom end of cognition, say compared to academic tasks, which are more of a higher level of cognition. Now, just so that you know that the concept of visual processing is still very relevant in the science today, I've included this study here, which is a brain imaging study. And it looks at the role of visual attention in dyslexia. And by visual attention, I basically mean a visual processing task that has competing elements to it. So this actually includes most of the visual tasks that are used by optometrists when we're working with students with learning difficulties. So these same authors of this study, they rightly point out that phonological processing has typically been considered the main cause of dyslexia. And however, visual attention type processing has also been described as well. And what these researchers did was quite interesting. They actually did a series of brain scans called functional MRIs. So I'm sure most of you have heard of MRI scans. And then they did something interesting, which is a little bit newer these days. They did something called a connectivity analysis. And what they were actually looking for, was how good are the connections between the certain areas of the brain. And so what they found was compared to dyslexic students, typical readers showed greater functional connectivity between the dorsal attention network, which is basically like the visual processing network, and the left angular gyrus, which is basically the language network. And this was while they were performing a variety of reading tasks. So basically, their study found that the higher the connectivity values were, then the higher the reading comprehension. And so I point this out because, you know, right there in a nutshell, we have a picture of why we need to facilitate better visual connections in the brain to support language. The authors also put forward this model. Hopefully you can read it, but I'm not saying that it's accurate necessarily, but what it does show is these various inputs that go into decoding and reading comprehension. And they put the inputs down as phonological awareness, working memory, something called inhibition, and visual attention. So the way that visual attention actually affects decoding is it enables the student to better identify the graphing in order that they can overlay the phonemic component onto the word. So, and of course, this all supports reading comprehension. So what I'm trying to do here is just give you guys a little bit of a framework now for how this all fits into the model. So I'm going to introduce another term for you, and that is eye tracking. And as the name suggests, this just refers to how we move our eyes. This is a mechanical skill, but it's closely linked to visual processing. So the better the visual processing, the more accurate we'll track on the page. But the better our eye tracking, then that will actually enhance visual processing. So the two are pretty much linked. So actually, for the purpose of our discussion, I tend to group them in together. When it comes to eye tracking, there's two main types of eye movements. One is the pursuit eye movements, and these are those slow, smooth eye movements, such as following a moving ball through the ear. And then we have these rapid eye movements. They're called saccades. And these are like stop-start eye movements. And these are the ones that we use for reading a book. It is worth pointing out that both these eye movements are controlled by the same region in the frontal brain. So they are different pathways, but they have overlapping neurology. So here's an example here of pursuit eye movements, and what we have is some students, it looks like they're in a PMP program, and they're actually following this swinging tennis ball overhead. As mentioned though, we don't use this eye movement to actually read a book, but keep in mind they do share similar pathways to the saccades. So if a student has poor eye tracking at this level, there is a reasonable chance that they'll also have difficulty controlling their eyes when they're reading a book. Over here on the other side, we have a slide by Dr. Hasselhoff, and it shows the difference in eye movements between a normal reader and a dyslexic reader when they're asked to just follow this path and track it with your eyes. And then it's mapped by an eye tracker, which is measuring their eye movements. And you'll see that in the case of the dyslexic reader, their eye movements are more erratic. And this is the case even though there's no language involved here. When it comes to pursuit eye movements, this is actually, and the link to dyslexia, or we can also extend that to learning difficulties generally, then there are a number of studies to support a link between pursuit eye movements and learning difficulties or dyslexia. This study here by Eden and Stein, they found that smooth pursuit eye movements revealed that poor smooth pursuits were more common in the dyslexic group. And then we have this bigger study here by Kalu and colleagues, and they actually did two very big studies on younger age children, ages 5 to 6.5. And what they found was interesting. They found that children who failed smooth pursuits actually had lower scores on a number of cognitive tasks but especially phonological awareness and the copying of visually presented trajectories. So yeah, so we don't use this eye movement to read, but it nevertheless is associated with learning difficulties. If we take a look at the saccade eye movements, and of course these are the rapid ones that we use for reading a book, then what happens is once the eyes land on a word, then we make a pause for about 1/3 of a second. And this is where we actually take in the information perceptually, that 1/3 of a second. And these pauses are referred to as fixations. We then make another jump eye movement, say across to the next word, take in the information, another jump eye movement, and basically that's how it goes. So when we're reading, it doesn't feel like jump eye movements, it probably feels smooth, but this is actually how we pull the information off the page. Once we get to the end of the line, we make a rapid eye movement or a large eye movement all the way back to the next line, and then we keep following the same sort of pattern. Every now and then we make these regressive or backwards saccades, and that's when we're not sure of something, we go back and then we continue the process. So I'm sure as teachers you've all experienced this many times when you're observing your students. Now, this is an interesting study that was just put out in 2021, and it looked at saccadic eye movements in students with neurodevelopmental disorder, which they included dyslexia, ADHD, and basically dyspraxia. And what happened in this particular task is the students were asked to rapidly look between their two pens that the examiner was holding up. And then they were scored on a variety of parameters, ability, precision, and whether there was any like head or body movements. And what you'll notice here is that for all the parameters, the students with the neurodevelopmental delays tended to score lower than those who were in the control group. And this, by the way, is what we're up against a little bit in optometry, because there are people and organisations who would have us believe, have you believe that eye movements are normal in dyslexia. The big problem that I have with that as an optometrist is that's actually not what we observe directly at the clinical level. So, so consequently, we take a different position. There are some high-tech ways of measuring eye movements. This is like an older eye tracker here, but over on the right is what the new eye trackers look like. They're very cool, and eye trackers would enable us to drill down even further into the problems. But the main setback we have at the moment is that we still need better software so that optometrists can use it diagnostically. So for the rest of the talk, what I'd like to do is maybe look at why we need to bring visual and auditory interventions into the school environment. And the first reason is that there has been actually relatively little change to learning outcomes. And I'm going to bring up some data here. It is actually US data looking at students' reading scores over the last 50 years. And I should probably emphasize that I'm actually talking here about reading outcomes generally rather than specifically students with learning difficulties. But if we go across to this slide, then on the right-hand side here, then what we have is reading outcomes as measured by their NAEP scores for students ages 9, 13, and 17. And we can see that from 1971 across to 2004, that the reading scores have remained relatively flat, apart from a little bit of an uptick here in the younger age group. If we compare it to the graph over on this side, then what we have is the actual spending or expenditure per child over the same time frame. And this is actually measured in what they refer to as constant dollars, or inflation adjusted. And we see that over this time frame, the average cost or expenditure per pupil had increased by 2.3 times. So this despite the reading scores remaining flat. I managed to look into it a little bit further to see if I could find some more recent data. And actually we find a very similar pattern going up to 2019. Fairly, pretty much no change for the older age group, not much change for the middle group, and just that small uptick there for the 9-year-old group. What did change, however, interestingly enough, was the spending per child had actually increased to 3.2 times in inflation-adjusted dollars. This is a graph showing a similar thing. It just goes out to 2017, just showing those flat reading scores. If we look a little bit closer to home, then this slide here shows the scores of 15-year-old students in New Zealand. And this is based on the PISA findings. And in fact, we don't really fare too much better. And in actual fact, from 2000 to 2018, it's showing a small decline going on there. So, interestingly enough on this, the findings also show that around about 80 to maybe 85% at best of 15-year-old students actually meet the basic standards. So that tells me that there's roughly like a 20% group that don't really quite meet the standards by the time they get into the higher levels of school. Also, you're probably aware better than me that the PISA data is showing that it's estimated that only 60% of 15-year-olds are reading above the most basic level, sort of post-COVID, which is curious. And as I say, I think you guys will know a lot more about that story than me. So the interesting question then is, how do we approach this? And one approach may be to look at the different aspects of or components of reading to see if there's a particular issue that needs addressing. Another approach would be to maybe stand back and look at the bigger picture to see if there are other factors that may be involved. If we look at the 5 components of reading, and again, this is not my expertise, so I'm not going to focus too much on it, but you're probably familiar with these 5 components of reading. But the main thing that's interesting here for me, I've highlighted point 4, fluency, in bold. And by fluency, I mean decoding, identifying sight words, speed and accuracy. And I've highlighted it because this would be the area that visual interventions would be most likely to impact upon. If we stand back and take the big picture approach, then we can look at reading in terms of the learning pyramid. And this pyramid is basically a developmental pyramid, and it doesn't account for factors like social issues or economic status, but it is more of a physiological approach. And basically at the bottom, we've got the physical sensory input, things like eyesight, hearing, taste, smell, touch, body awareness, balance, that sort of thing. And this then feeds into more functional skills, gross and fine motor skills, eye movements, focusing, binocular vision, which in turn supports this lower level cognitive processing. And this is where the visual and auditory processing comes in. So this red area here in turn supports higher cognitive skills, which would be your reading skills. And of course, that includes other aspects of learning, but just for simplicity, I've just got reading skills, and these academic skills support other higher thinking skills, if you like, problem solving, time management, and so on. And all this is to support academic achievement. So ideally, if we could identify and provide some targeted support at this level, then maybe we could also make a difference by addressing this level here. Certainly, if we consider vision for a moment and just how important it is for learning, then it's estimated that around 70 to 80% of our learning input actually comes through the visual system. So this is the main sensory modality. And of course, all you need to do is close your eyes and then think about how you'd progress at school. Yeah, that wouldn't be so good. More than 50% of the outer cortex, the outer brain, is devoted to processing visual information. So that's interesting because our vision's not just like a little area at the back of our brain that's important. It actually networks and links with so many areas. So as I've mentioned, vision supports the higher cognitive skills. So a problem at the visual or the auditory level is going to have a downstream effect. Just to illustrate this point, then I want to consider some of the visual skills that would actually use for reading. And you may not have thought about this before, but it's actually quite interesting because when a student looks at a book, the first thing they need to know is where is the word on the page. So we take these things for granted, by the way, but the visual system's always working in the background to identify where the word is. We need to be able to count the number of letters in a word. By that I mean we need to estimate the size of a word, and that's very important. Like, is it a big word, a small word, a medium-sized word? We need to do this because we need to know where to position our eyes correctly when we're making these saccadic eye movements. Once we make the eye movement, which is a highly coordinated event, we need to then keep the word steady on the page. Remember those fixations where we pause for a third of a second to take the information in. And while we're doing that, we need to extract as much information off the page as possible. This would be the visual span, if you like. And only then do we identify the letters in a word. So if we only look at letters in a word, what you can read on a letter chart, we refer to this as acuity, then you can see that we're actually going to miss quite a lot of potential problems that actually go into the process of reading. This is illustrated here by a study, Rosner and Rosner, some optometrists. They published it in an optometry journal way back in 1987. Hopefully you guys can see this. But what they found was there were two areas that were significant for kids with learning difficulties. The first one was actually referred to there as refractive error, and that's basically is the student long-sighted, short-sighted, astigmatism, probably terms you're familiar with. And they looked at a group of students with no learning difficulties and students with learning difficulties. For those with no learning difficulties, most of the students had no problems with refractive error. 91% were good. And for those with learning difficulties, only about 46% were actually had a normal refractive error. So that's pretty interesting. That was a very significant difference. And most of the problems, so basically 54% of them actually had some sort of refractive error that was significant. And most of that would have been hyperopia or long sight. And long sight is quite interesting because a student that has long sight, they can self-correct it. And so they'll still present with good eyesight on the letter chart. They'll still show up as 20/20. The other thing they found as being significant was this one down here, the perceptual skills. So you can see the group with no learning difficulties, around 25% of them, which is interesting, actually had a perceptual deficit, whereas those with learning difficulties are close to 80%, so a lot higher. Again, highly significant. One thing that I find interesting about this slide is this 25%, because it raises the possibility that maybe we could actually improve the learning in these students that weren't necessarily flagged as having a learning difficulty. Again, it's quite a detailed slide here, but this here is from a paper put out in a medical eye journal. And on the vertical axis here, we actually have reading speed. And down the bottom here, we actually have whether the students are long-sighted or short-sighted. So everything from here is long sight, and going this way is short sight. And what this study found was that the more long-sighted a student is, and keep in mind, most of these students actually have normal acuity, so they actually are seeing the letter chart okay, the slower their reading speed. But what I found especially interesting was this became significant at only about plus 1.25, which if you're used to like the ready-made glasses, 125 is quite a low strength. So yeah, so very interesting. Alrighty, the second reason that I have here for introducing visual and auditory interventions into the school is basically to enable a higher participation rate. So basically, the problem with visual and auditory interventions is they are quite specialized, and also they're pretty expensive. So if you take those two things together, that really translates into low accessibility. And to be honest, this is actually the #1 driving reason why I set about creating the Icept app. So as I say, this is quite a big problem. And the question is, exactly how common are these visual and auditory processing delays? Alrighty, well, back in 2005, I actually took a trip to Germany, and I met with this guy here, Professor Burkhard Fischer, who's a neurobiphysicist at the Freiburg University. And I went across and visited his research facility, basically because he'd done the biggest data collection of sensory skills on students with dyslexia that I could find. I looked around and said, who's done the biggest study in the world? And this is where it led me. And to this day, I still think it's probably the biggest. But what he found was interesting. If you look up here, he found 99.9% of students with dyslexia had a visual or auditory problem, and about 80 to 92% had a problem with both, depending on age. So very common, but also what should be kept in mind is these problems are also common in students with learning difficulties, even though they wouldn't be considered dyslexic. Actually, when I was talking to Professor Fischer, we actually joked once that these problems are probably more common in kids without dyslexia. So I know that's hard to imagine, but the point is that these problems are common. Oh, this is just an example photograph of his research facility. I like to highlight Fisher's work just because I think it's such good research. Bringing it a little bit closer to home, there is a New Zealand study. It's not as rigorous at all, but quite a few years ago, a study was done at Rotorua Lakes High School, and they found that around 70% of students in a remedial program actually had visual problems, and about 25% of Year 9 students generally had visual problems. So they then did a follow-up study on that, and they looked at years 2, 4, 7, and 9, and which was around about 1,100 students. And what they found was about 24 to 50% actually failed the visual testing, and this tended to be higher in the lower socioeconomic groups. So again, my main point here is that vision problems are common. I thought these findings actually compared quite well with the findings of Rosner that I showed you earlier. You can see here the Rotorua study, 24% generally, about 25% here with the perceptual skills. And in the case of the learning difficulty group, around about 80%, 70%. So in a similar kind of ballpark. So these problems are common, and I guess the question is, who are the students who are affected? And they really comprise of a range of students. As I maybe indicated earlier, there's quite a few students out there that maybe are considered to be doing okay, but they just have anomalies in their learning. So, but you know, they may not be bad enough to be flagged again for learning support. So that's a group. Mild to moderate learning difficulties is the biggest group. The dyslexia group, dyspraxia, developmental delays. It's actually fairly common for me to see students that have been born prematurely. They do reasonably good at school, but they hit a point where they haven't quite got the development to match, if you like, the academic rigor. So this is a definite group. ADHD, mild autism, post-concussion. The post-concussion one is interesting because a child might have concussion playing sports, and medically they might get checked out and all the boxes are ticked, but then and the parents think that everything's fine, but from that point in time their interest in school might drop back. And so there's always the possibility that visual development has been impaired a little bit due to a sporting concussion. So I estimate at least 20% of students have some kind of issue here, and possibly though up to 40%, you know, if we include those kids that don't technically have a learning disability, but they're students that maybe we could enhance their learning for. So the next reason that I have here is that to inform teachers regarding the visual and auditory aspects of the puzzle. If a teacher has a student's learning profile on the one hand and their visual and auditory profile on the other, then it's going to be very helpful information for the teacher in terms of seeing why a child might be having some issues. As things stand currently, there does appear to be a lack of information on this for teachers, particularly in the visual domain. So if we go to the Ministry of Education website, for example, and Google auditory processing disorders, then there's quite a bit of information to be read, so that's great. If we click on visual processing, there's not a lot of information. I did check it recently, and there's actually some information there on eye-hand coordination for younger children, but not really on visual processing as such. So why this lack of information on visual processing? Well, there's actually a lot of studies out there which do show a positive link between vision and learning difficulties and dyslexia, but there are also some studies that show no link. So I guess if you're a researcher, maybe from the Ministry of Education, that could create a little bit of doubt or uncertainty. But we need to keep in mind that this is always the case with science. You never get like 100% agreement on anything. And what I want to do is just give you two main reasons why studies actually show no link. Because I'm coming from the clinical point of view, and some things actually stand out a lot for me looking at the literature. And the first reason is poor targeting of visual skills. So that's to say, if you don't look at the right kinds of visual skills, then you're not going to find a link. And so what are the right kind of visual skills? Well, the answer to that are skills that usually take a long time to develop and involve rapid processing. So I gave you some examples of what that might be on an earlier slide. So that would be these ones here. And I won't dwell on the specifics of these too much. I do go into this in more detail on a subsequent presentation, but this gives you the idea. So the other main reason, and I think this is key, is actually poor sensitivity of the visual test. And if you can, try and hang in with me for this one, because I actually think that it's really critical, possibly the missing piece. And what I mean by this is some researchers, they actually fail to consider the cognitive load of the visual task relative to age. So what I mean by that is as clinicians and like as teachers, then we tend to automatically account for this without thinking about it. So for example, as a teacher, you wouldn't give a reading test that was designed for a student who's say 8 years of age to a group of 12-year-old students. If you did, then as you know, everyone's going to pass the test, and you'd find that there would be no poor readers. And in fact, dyslexia would magically disappear. So once you make the test difficult enough, though, that is adequately difficult for age, then you're going to start finding differences. And this is true for reading, it's true for eye tracking, and it's true for visual perception. So it's my particular view that if this was properly understood, then vision would have been flagged as a critical factor many years ago. What you'll find is that most people who claim that vision is not a factor, they usually don't have a developmental framework in their thinking. And so this comes from the fact that very few researchers actually look at how vision changes with age. In fact, Fisher was one of the few that actually did this. And when I realized that was the case, it actually shocked me, because when you think how important vision is to learning, you'd think that there'd be a ton of researchers out there looking at how vision changes with age. But this turns out not to be the case. So let me, on the downhill stretch here, let me give you an example of an eye tracking task that's developmentally challenging for kids with learning difficulties. And in this slide here, we have an eye tracker. It's an older style tracker. And at the bottom are these little sensors to measure the eye movements. And up the top here on this box, there's actually a laser beam that projects out, and it projects like a spot onto the wall in front of the student at the same visual angle that they would use when they're moving their eyes for reading. So the test would begin with a red dot like this on the wall in front of the student. And then the laser projects a spot to the side, and we ask the student to look over to the blank area on the opposite side. And this is what we refer to as an anti-saccade, because it's on the opposite side to the spot. And this turns out to be a fairly demanding test for the students. It's a more cognitively loaded test, doesn't depend on reading at all. And then it goes blank. So I'll just give it to you again. So spot, and then look to the other side, and then blank. So probably when I gave you that demo, you all looked to the red spot, but the goal is to move your eyes to the opposite side. Once this is done, then we can actually measure the number of errors that are made on a chart like this. And one thing that's interesting is notice the long time delay here for eye tracking to begin to reach adult levels of maturation. So this is the good readers here, and their eye tracking continues to develop all the way through high school. Notice also that the task is more difficult for students with dyslexia. Up at age 7 here, this is really just the floor effect, because the task is so difficult that both groups find it actually too difficult, and therefore they both make a whole bunch of errors. Whoa. So this leads me to the third concept, and that is that there are 2 key characteristics of processing skills that affect learning. And this is really the crux of the matter. Skills that take a long time to develop, and skills that involve rapid processing. So this is not like eyesight, because remember, when a student starts school and we're measuring acuity, what can you read on the chart? We expect that to be top notch. We expect them to be reading the bottom line when they start school, but not so for these other skills. So just another thing to point out here, that these interventions that I'm referring to, we consider them to be complementary interventions. So that is to say, they're not replacement. They're not designed to be like a replacement for conventional therapy. We still need educational interventions. We still need behavioral optometry. We still need occupational therapy and audiology. Finally here, just my final point, why we really need visual auditory type interventions at school, and that's basically because they can make a difference. So there's quite a lot of evidence for this, and I don't really go into it now. I discuss it in a later presentation, but what I am going to do just for the time being is to show you this one study by Peters and co-workers. And I'm showing you this one because it's a systematic review, and these are generally considered a high level of evidence, published in 2019. So this study looks at the efficacy of dynamic visual attention interventions for reading in dyslexic students compared to non-dyslexic. And firstly, they rightly note that dyslexia is associated with both phonological and visual attention deficits. They then go on and do a literature review of computer-based visual attention interventions for dyslexics ages 5 to 15. And they came up with about 1,266 unique articles. That in itself is quite interesting, because it gives you an idea that there actually is quite a bit of information out there on this area. They selected 18 because they had quite a strict inclusion criteria, and the authors of all these 18 studies considered that their intervention was primarily a visual attention intervention. So the results that they found was they found that visual attention training did indeed benefit reading fluency. So that's your speed and accuracy. And as a consequence of that, you've got comprehension as well. So this is not surprising, because remember, this is the area that we expect visual interventions to have the biggest impact. Visual attention interventions for treating childhood dyslexia actually generally improved reading equal to or even greater than the other strategies. But again, this is not to say that other strategies are not important. The effects of the training actually persisted for about 2 months, and that's because this wasn't really measured beyond that. So there seems to be a persistent effect. And finally, they just point out some limitations. The larger they indicated that a larger sample for intervention would be great, and also testing across a wider range of reading skills. So that's basically it there for part 1 of the role of visual and auditory processing. And what we've covered today is some basic concepts, some basic terms and definitions. And I've presented to you some reasons why visual and auditory processing would be valuable in the school setting. So that's basically it. Maybe I can hand it back to you there, Jenny.
You can. Thank you very much. That was great. And I think one of the key things for us in schools is what we wanted to really know today is why, what is the problem? Why do we actually have the problem? And what research is there behind it? And when we look at the fact that we now know that up to 70% of children with learning differences and difficulties have some kind of visual problem, it becomes really imperative that we start looking a bit further for the question. Now, I'm going to invite you to unmute yourself, and if you've got questions, and just ask those of Stuart. But before I do, I think what I'm so excited about, when Stuart approached me about his next steps in his work, I felt what was so exciting is that he's actually giving schools the opportunity of doing 3 or 4 sessions of training, and then having the support to implement things into schools and giving the tools and resources. And that's something that we've actually never had before. And having someone, Stuart, of your caliber, who's done all that research, who's got the resources and the capability of sharing that training with us is just amazing. So we will be sending out the information on how you can access the next steps. And so what you will get is the series of training webinars. You'll actually have the support and backup from Stuart to implement learning and vision supports for your students. And as he mentioned earlier, there will be 3 Icept licenses so that you can start unpacking what you're learning and using them with students. Now, I'm kind of guessing that some of you might be saying, I want to do this training as a teacher. So we're going to be having an individual rate, and the individual rate for the series is $180 plus GST. And if your school would like to go through the training, you can put a number of people on the training, and it's $350 plus GST for the school. But we'll send all this out tomorrow, or not this week anyway. You'll have it before the end of term. You will also have the recording. So I would just like to invite you to unmute yourself and ask any questions from Stuart directly. And Madeline, if I could ask you, please, to number all the people that have joined the presentation today. And I noticed that a school has put up that they've got 5. So can you make 5 numbers for that school, or 2 numbers where there's 2 or whatever? And after we've got questions, I'll pick on someone here to give us a number to draw out from the hat as the winner of the book. So Maria, have you got a question there? I see you've unmuted yourself.
Yep, so I've unmuted. We have been doing a bit of digging while we're listening, of course, at the same time, and noticing that Icept is only used on iPads. Would that be correct, Stuart? And if that's the case, yeah, how do we, obviously we have to do the course, but how does it work with the iPad? I'm really curious about how that works.
Sure, yeah. The actual testing side is only on the iPad. And I did this to try and keep it standardized, because the moment you go to lots of different platforms, then the way the stimuli are presented can look quite different. But having said that, the actual training side is available on iPad or computer. So this would be like Windows or Mac. Mac is great just because everything's programmed on Apple, but it's not functional on Chromebooks, that's all, just because the way Chromebooks work. Yeah.
Actually, if I can just sort of add to that, Most schools, even if they're not an Apple school, have been purchasing one iPad so that they can just do all the testing on it, and they have all the test results on that. And I've also been working with families and parents, actually, even if they don't have an iPad in the house, no one's had a problem borrowing one to do the actual test. So although the assessment is only available on iPad, we haven't found that a problem. Thank you. And we have a hand up over here. If you'd like to unmute yourself.
Anyway, I've just got a question there, for Stuart regarding aphantasia. APHANTASIA. It's the one there where, yeah. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah.
So because obviously that's something about the part, because sometimes part of the reading there is to be able to visualize what they're reading there, but if a learner can't visualize it, because it's a form there. So is there something about that one there for children who's got that?
Yeah, when I'm engaging with parents, I sometimes will show them some skills for visualizing words, for example, visualizing words for spelling. And I also like visualizing for learning maths. But the Icept intervention is probably the next level down. So I think of visualization as the very top level of vision. But putting into place good visual skills is actually important if we're going to actually visualize in the first place. So it's not so much directed at visualization, but once you go down this pathway, then things like visualization we can put some resources out for. Yeah, hopefully that makes sense. So not primarily in the Icept app, it's more visual processing per se.
Also, I just wanted to add to a point here. Someone's asked, how can teachers identify and negotiate how to help? And that will be covered in the next series. And everybody who does the series of webinars will have the tools, the skills, and the resources to provide that remediation. Anyone else? Just unmute yourself if we can't see you, and just jump in. Mute yourself again.
We were just wondering about the $350 license plus GST. There is 5 of us in the junior team. Would that cover the 5 of us at our school?
Absolutely.
Yes.
And if your school wanted to have your senior part of the team as well, that covers your senior part of the team as well. So that's one of the reasons why we want to give you the recording, so that you can share it with others. Because the other thing that we have found is that if you only train 1 or 2 people in the school, and those 1 or 2 people move on, the knowledge and the program is actually lost. And both Stuart and myself are very keen to ensure as many people as possible in the school are trained, so that we have the longevity and you get the value for having spent that money. Okay, now don't hesitate to email me if you've got some other questions, and we can direct them through to Stuart if necessary. But we will be communicating with you all regarding the next steps information, and also sending out the recording so that you can share it with others. So before we go, Maddie, could you please, you're ready for the draw? And I'm going to ask Jenny Bainbridge. Jenny, could you please pick a number between? Madeline, what's the numbers between?
1 and 20, please.
19.
19.
19 is Lorraine T. So I think we've got Lorraine T from SCCS. Yep.
Excellent, fantastic. That's well done. And we'll be sending out a book your way. And there's also some information in there on visual processing and Stuart Warren's work, but you'll get, it's a handbook for schools on raising achievement for children with learning difficulties. So it's been, oh, fantastic. Have you got a question, Jenny? No, you're just waving. It's been fantastic to have you all here today. We look forward to sharing the next session with you, and I really look forward to this ongoing journey for your schools with Stuart. So we'll be in touch. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Stuart.